Hi YouTube! Welcome to day 29 of my birthday countdown vlog. 11 more days until my 40th birthday. So when I was 11, it was 1983, and that year started off rather difficult for everyone in my family. On February 28th, 1983, which happened to be the exact same day that the finale of MASH was on TV, my grandfather suffered from a rather massive stroke. I think my grandmother found him in bed and he wasn't responsive and we called the ambulance. Now, like I said, I was 11, and my grandmother didn't think a hospital was an appropriate place for me, especially since we didn't know what was going on yet. So she and my mom went with my grandfather in the ambulance to the hospital, and they left me at home. I was 11, I was a mature, responsible child, so they didn't need to call a babysitter or anything like that. Although they did call me and check in on me a few times. And of course, the reason I remember the whole thing with MASH is because that's what I was watching on television at the time when all of this was happening. And my grandmother would call, or my mother would call, with updates on what was going on with my grandfather. And we didn't get a full picture of how severe the stroke had been until the next day. And he was basically hit in the motor area of his brain, and he had difficulty with motor control. After that, he could barely lift his arm and even mark an X sign for things. And unfortunately, over the next 2 or 3 months, he suffered even more debilitating strokes, to the point where he had absolutely no motor control whatsoever anymore. I think blinking his eyes, which is, I think, an autonomic response, was probably about the only thing left that he could do. He couldn't even swallow for himself anymore, although we were reluctant to put him on a feeding tube. And they did, after, I think he was in one hospital for a couple of months, and then they transferred him to another hospital. I do remember that. And then at the other hospital, he was supposed to be on soft foods that they could help him chew and swallow himself. And I still remember coming in. My grandmother and I, after I was done with school each day, would go in and visit him every single day, 7 days a week. We would go and spend a few hours. And one time we walked in and there was a new nurse on the floor, and she was trying to force my grandfather to eat fried chicken, which he couldn't. I mean, there was just no way. And she was acting like he was being stubborn, like, "Oh, stop being so stubborn, old man. You've got to eat this food or you'll die." And she was literally trying to shove this piece of chicken in his mouth. And my grandmother pulled that woman off of him and pushed her back onto there was nobody in the bed next to him at the time, and just pushed her back on that bed. And we called for the doctor, and thankfully our doctor, my grandfather's doctor, or actually our family doctor, was there at the time, and was like, "What's going on?" And my grandmother told him, and I said, "Yeah," I confirmed the story because we both saw it. And boy, did he give that nurse a chewing out, and I think she was fired right on the spot, because he was like, "Did you not read this man's chart? The man has had severe strokes, he has no motor control, he is supposed to be on soft foods. What do you think you're doing?" So that was a rather memorable point in all of that. And it was heart-wrenching to watch, because my grandfather was such a intelligent man. He had a background in mechanical engineering. He worked for Senko for many years in terms of working on tool development, and he was an inventor. And all of a sudden, to see him laying like that And you could tell that the intelligence part of his brain was still working. You could see in his eyes, how much he was suffering from all of this. And, we didn't know what we were going to do. He was, obviously, he was already retired. He was drawing Social Security, so he was on Medicare. And Medicare was slowly but surely, like, running out. Like, we were running out of options. And it was looking like he was going to need long-term care because he wasn't regaining his motor control skills. And then finally in April, he suffered a massive cardiac event on top of yet another massive stroke. And at this point he was on feeding tubes and he was on a number of things. And as a family, my grandmother and my mother and my uncle decided to not resuscitate at that point. He was suffering. We knew he was suffering. And at that point it was just better to let him go. It was painful for us to let him go, but he wasn't going to get any better. In fact, he was just getting worse with each attack, and it was the right decision. And I still remember I was walking home from school, and I was still going to the private school at the time, so I was still in my school uniform, I remember. And my uncle and my aunt and I think it was my grandmother in the car, drove and picked me up as I was walking home from school. And I immediately knew if my uncle was in town that something big had happened. And they said, well, we'll tell you when we get home. So we got home, and they said, they told me the news that he had passed. He had had another major event, and that they had decided to not resuscitate and basically unplug all the machines. And I was numb. A part of me was relieved because I knew he wasn't suffering anymore. A part of me, I know, was sad because I wouldn't see him again. But I was just numb. I mean, it had been, 3 or 4 months at this point, and just every day going and visiting and worrying and seeing the suffering. And I think I was just emotionally drained at this point. I mean, I was only 11 years old. And my first reaction when I heard the news was, can I sleep in his bed tonight? My grandmother hadn't changed the sheets or anything in his bed since the initial stroke happened back in February. So his bed still had his scent on it. So as of that night when he passed away, I slept in his bed and I never moved out. So within a couple of months, my grandmother sold my old frilly princess bed set that I had and took over the alcove that I had as my bedroom and used it as her bedroom. And I moved into my grandfather's bedroom. And I don't think I let her wash those sheets or pillowcases for at least a month afterwards. Eventually she had to wash them, obviously. It was getting gross. But I just needed to have his scent every night for a while. And she understood that. And as I slowly kind of came out of this kind of numb funk that I was in, finally I was able to let go and let her wash it. But that was a very poignant time for me as a young child. Oh, I guess I wasn't that young, but I was still pretty young, obviously. And it was my first real loss. I had, there were other folks that we had known that had passed away, but this was the first person that was really close to me. He'd been my best friend. I used to work with him in his shop, in the basement, and things. And one thing that still strikes me now that I know is that a month before my grandfather passed away, my dad also passed away, which at the time I didn't know. I had no contact with my dad or his family at that time. I didn't find out until I was 26, when I finally found my sisters, did I find out that my dad had passed away in March of 1983. So, I'm actually kind of glad, because of everything that was going on with my grandfather, I'm kind of glad I didn't know about things going on with my dad, because I don't know how that would have affected me emotionally that year. The whole thing with Opie was fairly profound as it was. If I had known about my dad on top of all that, yeah, I don't know how I would have handled that. I might have handled it just fine, I don't know. You never know how much strength you have until you have to go through something like that. So, anyway, that was 1983 for me. The rest of the year is pretty much a blur at this point. I just went to school and that was it. Alright, well, until tomorrow, bye.